In historic Charleston, a grieving widow was about to give a eulogy at her husband's memorial. What started as a somber farewell took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a venomous whisper that shattered everything she believed. Margaret Whitmore wasn't your typical Southern matriarch. For 40 years, she had built her life around dignity, tradition, and loyalty, known for her composure, her bookish precision, and a marriage that defined her. When she heard her daughter-in-law whisper, "Now the house is mine," she had no idea she was stepping into a quiet war for her legacy. Margaret's search for answers would lead to buried secrets, betrayals, and a family unraveling at the seams. What began as a memorial would become a reckoning. The Charleston estate that once stood for unity would never be the same after Margaret decided to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The key. Charleston sunlight fell through the leaded glass windows in patterns Margaret Whitmore had memorized over 40 years. Golden honeycombed shapes that traveled across the living room floor, marking time like a sundial. Today, they illuminated unfamiliar black shoes and somber dresses, strangers in her sanctuary. Margaret, Walter was a pillar of the community. "We're all just devastated." Judge Hastings pressed her hand between his damp palms. His voice carried the practiced solemnity of someone who'd attended too many memorials. "If there's anything at all you need." Margaret nodded, her spine straight as the bookshelf Walter had built when they first moved in. "Thank you, Henry. You're very kind." Her voice remained steady, measured, just as it had through the funeral service and the procession that followed. Just as it had when the doctor explained there was nothing more they could do. Just as it always had. Across the crowded living room, she caught sight of Camilla refilling wine glasses, her movements efficient and graceful. Her daughter-in-law's black dress fit impeccably, the perfect picture of respectful mourning. Yet there was something in her posture that seemed expectant, as though she were hosting rather than supporting. "Mom?" David appeared at Margaret's elbow, his father's jawline prominent against his too pale skin. "Judge Langston wants to know if we're still planning to say a few words." Margaret studied her son, searching for traces of grief behind his eyes. There was sadness there, certainly, but something else too. Avoidance. The same look he'd given her when he'd failed algebra and waited 3 weeks to tell them. "Yes, of course," she replied, smoothing her charcoal dress. "I've prepared something. Will you be speaking?" David's eyes flicked toward Camilla, who was now arranging food on the dining room table. "I don't think I can, Mom. I don't have the words." Margaret wanted to press her palm against his cheek, the way she had when he was small and frightened. But that gesture had been rejected too many times over the years. Instead, she nodded. "I understand." She didn't understand. Not how her son could stand mute at his father's memorial. Not how the neighbors who'd borrowed their lawnmower for 20 years could suddenly look at her with such awkward pity. And certainly not how she was supposed to step into this next chapter without Walter's steady hand guiding her. June Abernathy materialized beside her, offering a cup of tea. "Here, drink this before you talk. You need something warm in you." Her oldest friend's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "You're doing beautifully, Margaret. Walter would be proud." Margaret accepted the cup, grateful for June's familiar abruptness. "Thank you. I'm fine, really." "Of course you're not fine," June snorted. "None of us are fine when we lose our husbands. But you're standing. That's what matters today." Margaret sipped the tea, letting its warmth steady her. In the corner, her grandchildren, Liam and Nora, sat close together on the window seat, uncomfortable in their dress clothes, watching the proceedings with wide eyes. Ellie hovered near them, her daughter's watchful gaze scanning the room periodically to check on Margaret. Judge Langston cleared her throat slightly, catching Margaret's attention. It was time. The room quieted as Margaret moved to the small space cleared near the fireplace, Walter's portrait watching over her shoulder. She unfolded the paper with her prepared words, though she knew them by heart. "Thank you all for coming today to remember Walter," she began. The room blurred slightly at the edges, but she pressed on, her librarian's voice carrying clearly. "For 40 years, Walter was my compass. Many of you knew him as a brilliant attorney, but I knew him as the man who could never remember where he put his reading glasses." A soft ripple of affectionate laughter moved through the room. Margaret continued, recounting Walter's dedication to justice, his quiet gardening obsession, his love for their children. She carefully measured each word, keeping her voice from breaking, maintaining the composure Walter had always admired. As she neared the end of her eulogy, she felt, rather than saw, Camilla move closer, standing just behind her left shoulder. "Walter's greatest joy was this home," Margaret concluded. "Building it with me, raising our children here, welcoming friends and family through its doors. His legacy lives on in these walls, in the memories we've created together, and in all of us who loved him." The room was silent for a moment before Judge Langston led a murmured, "Amen." As people began to shift and conversation resumed, Margaret felt Camilla lean in close, her perfume cutting through the scent of funeral flowers. "Now the house is mine," she whispered, her breath warm against Margaret's ear. Margaret froze, certain she had misheard. She turned to look at her daughter-in-law, whose face had already rearranged into a mask of sympathy. Camilla squeezed her arm gently before moving away to accept condolences from Walter's law partners. The room seemed to tilt. Margaret gripped the mantel, steadying herself against the sudden vertigo. What had Camilla meant? It had to be grief playing tricks, distorting an innocent comment into something sinister. But she knew what she'd heard. For the next 3 hours, Margaret performed the role expected of her. She accepted casseroles and embraces. She thanked people for coming. She watched as Camilla directed the catering staff with authoritative efficiency, her voice carrying across the room when decisions needed to be made. All the while, those 5 words echoed in Margaret's mind. "Now, the house is mine." When the last guest had gone, leaving only family, Margaret sank into Walter's leather chair. Ellie approached, concern etched across her features. "Mom, you need to rest. You've been on your feet all day." "I'm fine." The words came automatically. Ellie knelt beside the chair. "You're not fine. No one's fine today. Let me fix you a plate." From the kitchen, Margaret could hear Camilla talking to David, their voices too low to make out the words. Through the window, she watched as her grandchildren escaped to the backyard, Liam's tie already loosened, Nora kicking off her shoes in the grass. "Ellie," Margaret said quietly, "did Walter ever mention any changes to our will or any trusts?" Ellie frowned. "No. Why?" Margaret shook her head. "Just something Camilla said. It's probably nothing." "What did she say?" Ellie's voice sharpened. "Later," Margaret murmured as Camilla emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of coffee. "I've made fresh coffee," Camilla announced. "David's calling the funeral home to buy. Confirm everything's been handled." She set the tray down and smoothed her dress. "Margaret, you should know the lawyer will be contacting you next week. There are some arrangements Walter made that you'll need to discuss." Ellie straightened. "What arrangements?" Camilla's smile was practiced sympathy. "Just some estate matters. Nothing to worry about today." She touched Margaret's shoulder. Lightly. "Walter wanted everything to be taken care of. You know how he was, always planning ahead." Margaret met her daughter-in-law's eyes. There was something triumphant there, lurking beneath the surface. "Yes," she said slowly. "Walter was always thorough." That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Margaret slipped into Walter's study. The room still smelled of his pipe tobacco and the lemon oil he used on the desk. She hadn't entered since his death 3 weeks ago, preserving it like a shrine. With trembling hands, she turned on his desk lamp and began systematically searching through his files. Walter had been meticulous in his organization, a habit from decades of legal practice. If there were documents about the house, they would be properly labeled. She found them in the third drawer, in a folder marked Family, Trust. The paperwork was dated 8 months ago, while she had been visiting Ellie after her divorce. Her eyes scanned the legal language, catching phrases that made her heart clench. Transfer of deed. Sole beneficiary. Upon my death. At the bottom of the final page was Walter's familiar signature, alongside a name that seemed to burn. Through the paper, Camilla Elizabeth Whitmore. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, stifling the sound that threatened to escape. The trust was clear. Upon Walter's death, ownership of the house, their house, would transfer not to Margaret, but to their daughter-in-law. The room spun around her as 40 years of certainty crumbled. Why would Walter do this? How could he have made such a monumental decision without telling her? And why Camilla of all people? Margaret sank into Walter's chair, clutching the papers to her chest. The house had been their sanctuary, the place they'd built their lives together. The idea that he had secretly signed it away to Camilla was incomprehensible. Unless there was something else she didn't know. Something about Walter, about their marriage, about their family that had been hidden from her. Outside the study window, the Charleston moon cast silver light across the garden Walter had tended so carefully. The house creaked and settled around her, as it had done for 40 years. Only now, for the first time, Margaret wondered if it had ever truly been hers at all. Morning light crept across the study floor, finding Margaret still in Walter's chair. She hadn't moved for hours. The trust documents spread before her like evidence at a crime scene. Her eyes traced Walter's signature for the 100th time, searching for some sign of coercion, some indication that the bold, confident strokes weren't truly his. But there was no mistaking Walter's distinctive penmanship, the way his W swooped. Dramatically, the precise dot of his eyes. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6. Margaret gathered the papers with stiff fingers, her body protesting the night spent motionless. Legal phrases swam before her eyes. Irrevocable transfer. Exclusive right of occupancy. Beneficial interest. The door creaked open behind her. Ellie stood in the threshold, still in yesterday's clothes, her face creased with exhaustion. "Mom? Have you been here all night?" Margaret straightened the papers, instinctively hiding them before remembering this was her daughter, not an intruder. "I needed to check something," she said, her voice rough from disuse. Ellie stepped into the sanctum of her father's study, her eyes sweeping over the disturbed files. "What are you looking for?" Margaret hesitated, then handed over the trust documents. Ellie scanned them quickly, her expression darkening with each page. The silence stretched between them until Ellie slammed the papers down on the desk. "That manipulative bitch," she hissed. "Ellie, language," Margaret responded automatically, the librarian in her surfacing despite everything. "Language?" Ellie's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Mom, Camilla has somehow convinced Dad to sign over. Your house, our house, and you're worried about my language?" Margaret pressed her fingertips to her temples. "I don't understand it. Your father would never—" But the evidence lay before them, undeniable. Ellie paced the small study, her movements kinetic with rage. She must have done something, manipulated him somehow. Dad wouldn't just give away your home. "It's his signature," Margaret said quietly. "And look at the witnesses, Judge Langston and Martin Crowe. People he trusted." "That doesn't mean anything. Dad was sick. Maybe he wasn't thinking clearly. Margaret shook her head. The date, Ellie. This was signed 8 months ago, before the diagnosis. She touched the paper gently, as if it might reveal its secrets under her fingertips. He knew exactly what he was doing. Ellie stopped pacing, her fury giving way to confusion. Then why? Why would he do this? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Margaret folded the documents and rose stiffly from the chair. I need to speak with David. They found David in the kitchen, mechanically arranging funeral platters in the refrigerator. Camilla was nowhere to be seen. When confronted with the documents, David's eyes darted between his mother and sister, never settling, never meeting their gaze. Dad must have had his reasons, he said, closing the refrigerator door with deliberate care. He was always practical about these things. Practical? Ellie's voice rose. How is giving Camilla our family home practical? David shrugged, the motion too casual for the weight of the conversation. Asset protection, maybe? Tax purposes? I don't know, Ellie. Dad handled all that stuff. Margaret studied her son, noticing the tightness around his eyes, the way his fingers fidgeted with his wedding band. Did you know about this, David? His hesitation was answer enough. How long? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know the details, David said quickly. Just that Dad was updating some documents. He said it was better this way, cleaner. Cleaner? Ellie echoed. What does that even mean? David retreated toward the door. Look, this isn't a good time. There are still arrangements to handle, and Camilla's meeting with the funeral director about the headstone. The headstone can wait, Margaret said, her quiet tone carrying more authority than Ellie's outburst. I need to understand why your father did this. David's shoulders slumped. It was Dad's decision, Mom. Maybe. Maybe just respect that? With that, he slipped out, the screen door closing softly behind him. Margaret stared after him, something cold and unfamiliar settling in her chest. It wasn't just the house. Something larger was at play, something her family had conspired to keep from her. I'm calling June, Ellie declared, reaching for her phone. And then we're getting a lawyer. June arrived within the hour, still in her gardening clothes, soil under her fingernails. She listened intently as Margaret explained, her eyes growing narrower with each detail. That crafty little, June began, then glanced at Margaret and amended, woman. I never trusted her, with her perfect hair and those real estate commissions. Could she have forged it? Ellie asked. June shook her head. Not with those witnesses. But Margaret, honey, you need to contest this immediately. Get yourself a good probate attorney, not anyone from Walter's firm. Someone independent. Contested on what grounds? Margaret asked. It's legal. It's notarized. It's Walter's signature. Undue influence, June said firmly. Camilla. Could have pressured him. You need to move fast before she tries to sell it out from under you. The image of strangers walking through her home, appraising her life, made Margaret's stomach clench. Walter wouldn't have done this without a reason, she insisted. There must be an explanation. June and Ellie exchanged glances. Then June reached across the table, taking Margaret's hand in hers. Honey, I hate to say this, but men don't always tell their wives everything. Not Walter, Margaret said automatically. We didn't have secrets. June's expression softened with something that looked disturbingly like pity. Margaret, do you remember when Harold died, and I found out about that timeshare in Hilton Head? I never knew about? That was different, Margaret protested. Harold always had his little projects. And that secretary in Savannah? June raised an eyebrow. My point is, even good men keep things from their wives. Especially lawyers. Something in June's tone made Margaret look up sharply. What are you saying, June? June released Margaret's hand, suddenly very interested in brushing soil from her sleeve. Nothing specific. just that Walter was complicated. More complicated than maybe you knew. "Mom," Ellie interjected, "whatever Dad's reasons, the fact remains that Camilla is trying to take your home. We need to fight this." Margaret stared out the window at the garden. Walter's rose bushes needed pruning, the task he'd never completed. Had he known, even then, that the garden would soon not be his to tend? Had he kept other secrets, hidden like weeds beneath the manicured surface of their marriage? "I'll speak with an attorney," she conceded. "But first, I want answers. From David, from Judge Langston, from everyone who knew about this and said nothing while I planned Walter's funeral in a house that apparently isn't mine." Ellie nodded, already pulling up contacts on her phone. June squeezed Margaret's shoulder. "That's my girl. Fight for what's yours." But as they planned their next steps, Margaret wondered, had it ever truly been hers? Or had she simply been the caretaker of Walter's kingdom, soon to be displaced when her services were no longer required? That afternoon, as Ellie made calls and June researched attorneys, Margaret stood in Walter's closet, surrounded by his suits, his shoes, the physical remnants of the man she thought she knew completely. She reached into his jacket pockets, searching for, what? A note of explanation? A confession? In the breast pocket of his favorite navy suit, she found a receipt. Not for anything suspicious, just lunch at their usual place downtown. But the date caught her eye. The same day the trust was signed, and the amount was for 3 meals, not 2. A shadow passed behind her. Camilla stood in the doorway, her expression too controlled to read. "Looking for something specific?" Camilla asked, her voice pleasant, as if inquiring about a missing book. Margaret folded the receipt carefully, slipping it into her own pocket. "Just gathering clothes for donation?" she lied, the unfamiliar taste of deceit bitter on her tongue. Camilla's smile didn't reach her eyes. "How thoughtful. Let me know if you need boxes. I have plenty from the agency." She lingered a moment, longer than necessary. "By the way, I've scheduled a meeting with the estate attorney for Monday. There are some formalities to handle. Regarding the house." Their eyes met in silent battle. In that moment, Margaret realized she was done with being the gracious widow, the accommodating mother-in-law, the keeper of a peace that had already been shattered. "Yes," she said coolly. "I imagine there are." The Charleston County Courthouse stood like a marble fortress against the spring sky, its columns reaching toward heaven with an authority that made Margaret feel small as she climbed the steps. Ellie walked beside her, close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed, a reminder that Margaret wasn't facing this alone. "Ready?" Ellie asked, pausing at the heavy wooden doors. Margaret adjusted the lapel of her navy suit, the one she'd worn to countless faculty meetings during her librarian years. Armor of a sort. "As I'll ever be." Inside, the probate courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, more intimate, with polished oak benches and muted lighting. Camilla was already seated at one of the tables, her lawyer leaning close, whispering something that made her smile. She wore a tasteful gray dress that managed to suggest both respectful mourning and professional confidence. David sat behind her, his gaze fixed on his phone. "He couldn't even sit with you?" Ellie hissed, glaring at her brother. Margaret touched her daughter's arm. "Let it be." Their lawyer, Patricia Hollingsworth, recommended by June as the kind of woman who eats trust documents for breakfast, guided them to the opposite table. As they settled, Margaret caught David's eye briefly. He looked away first. Judge Marie Langston entered, her robes flowing behind her like dark wings. Margaret had known Marie socially for years, had served on charity committees with her, exchanged Christmas cards. Now the woman's face was professionally neutral as she took her seat. "Case number 2025 PT 341, the clerk announced. "Matter of the Walter Whitmore Family Trust." Judge Langston nodded. I've reviewed the preliminary filings. This is a petition to set aside provisions of an irrevocable trust established by Walter Whitmore, deceased, on the grounds of undue influence. Is that correct, Ms. Hollingsworth? Yes, Your Honor, Patricia replied, her Charleston accent softening the formal response. We contend that Mr. Whitmore was improperly influenced to transfer the family home to his daughter-in-law rather than his wife of 40 years. Camilla's lawyer, a silver-haired man named Bradford Ellis, rose smoothly. Your Honor, the trust document is perfectly clear and properly executed. Mr. Whitmore's intentions were stated explicitly and witnessed by 2 respected members of the legal community, including yourself. Judge Langston's gaze flickered to Margaret. Something like discomfort passed across her features before the judicial mask returned. I did witness Mr. Whitmore's signature, she acknowledged, and I can attest that he appeared of sound mind and under no obvious duress. Margaret felt the first cracks in her resolve. This woman, who had been at her Christmas table, was now confirming that Walter had willingly signed away their home. Be that as may, Patricia countered, we have concerns about conversations that may have occurred prior to the signing. Mrs. Whitmore was completely unaware of this transfer until after her husband's death. Ellis produced a folder with practiced efficiency. Your Honor, we have additional documents showing that this trust was part of a larger estate planning strategy Mr. Whitmore developed with considerable forethought. He extracted several papers, passing copies to Patricia. These are dated communications between Mr. Whitmore and his financial advisors, discussing the eventual transfer of the property. Margaret leaned forward, scanning the documents as Patricia placed them before her. Walter's distinctive handwriting covered the margins with notes, calculations, questions, considerations she'd never been privy to. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Langston addressed her directly, were you involved in your husband's estate planning discussions? Margaret swallowed against the dryness in her throat. Walter handled our financial affairs. I trusted him to make decisions. That would benefit us both. And did Mr. Whitmore ever express any intention to transfer the family home to Mrs. Camilla Whitmore? Never, Margaret said firmly. Not once in 40 years of marriage, Ellis interjected smoothly. Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore clearly felt that his wife did not need to be burdened with these complex financial matters. The documents demonstrate his careful consideration of the transfer. Judge Langston leaned back slightly. Ms. Hollingsworth, do you have any evidence of undue influence beyond Mrs. Whitmore's exclusion from these discussions? Patricia hesitated. We're gathering evidence, Your Honor. We believe there may have been a pattern of manipulation that culminated in this transfer. Ellis smiled thinly. Speculation, Your Honor. The proceedings continued for another hour, a dance of legal terminology and procedural questions that left Margaret feeling increasingly displaced. This was Walter's world. The precise language, the careful interpretations, the deference to written intent over spoken promises. She had always been an outsider here. Very well, Judge Langston finally said. I'll need character references from both parties, as well as any additional evidence regarding Mr. Whitmore's state of mind and intentions. We'll reconvene in 3 weeks. She looked directly at Margaret. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand this is difficult, but the court must follow Mr. Whitmore's documented wishes unless there's compelling evidence they were improperly obtained. As they gathered their belongings, Margaret noticed Camilla leaning close to David, her hand on his arm, her expression concerned. The perfect daughter-in-law, consoling her husband through this difficult time. The perfect act. Outside in the corridor, Ellie exploded. This is absurd. Dad would never have wanted you homeless. Patricia's expression was grave. It's not quite that simple, Ellie. The trust gives your mother lifetime occupancy rights. She can't be evicted immediately, but ownership and decision-making authority rest with Camilla. What does that mean exactly? Margaret asked. It means, Patricia explained gently, that you can continue living there, but Camilla controls any decisions about the property, renovations, refinancing, and eventually, sale. Ellie swore, under her breath. And what happens if Mom outlives Camilla's generosity? Patricia didn't answer, which was answer enough. As they descended the courthouse steps, Margaret spotted Camilla speaking with a woman she recognized as a real estate agent from Camilla's firm. She caught snippets of their conversation: market assessment, comps in the neighborhood, potential listing. Camilla saw her watching and smiled, a smile that never reached her eyes. "Margaret, Tamara was just asking after you. Isn't that thoughtful?" The real estate agent looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm so sorry for your loss. Walter was a wonderful man." "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "He was." She turned away, unwilling to give Camilla the satisfaction of seeing her distress. Later, at home, the home that was apparently no longer hers, Margaret sat in the sunroom, staring. Out at Walter's garden, 40 years of memories seemed to rise from the floorboards like ghosts, bringing David home as a newborn, Ellie's graduation parties, quiet evenings reading while Walter worked at his desk. How could all of this be reduced to legal documents? And property assessments? "Mom?" Ellie appeared in the doorway. Patricia called. "She thinks we should gather testimonials from Dad's friends, colleagues, anyone who might have insight into his intentions." Margaret nodded absently. "Also," Ellie continued, hesitant now, "I've been thinking. Maybe there's something in Dad's papers that could help, something we missed." "I've been through everything," Margaret sighed. "There's nothing." "What about his journals? The ones he kept in his desk drawer?" Margaret looked up, confused. "Journals? Walter didn't keep journals." Ellie crossed to her mother's side, kneeling beside her chair. "Mom, Dad kept journals for years. Small leather-bound ones. I used to see him writing in them when I was little." "Those were case notes," Margaret corrected. "For work." Ellie shook her head. "No, these were different. Personal. Sometimes he'd lock them in his desk when I came in." Margaret stared at her daughter, a strange sensation crawling up her spine. After 40 years of marriage, how could there be something so fundamental? She didn't know. "Show me," she whispered. They returned to Walter's study, now feeling less like a sanctuary and more like an archaeological site, a place to excavate the truth of a man Margaret was beginning to realize she might not have fully known. Ellie went directly to the bottom drawer of Walter's desk, the one Margaret had always assumed contained old case files. "He kept it locked, but—" She reached beneath the drawer, her fingers finding a hidden lever. The false bottom popped up, revealing a compartment beneath. Inside lay 5 leather-bound journals, their spines cracked with use. Margaret lifted the topmost one with trembling fingers, opened it to a random page, and found Walter's handwriting staring back at her. Not case notes, not legal strategies, personal reflections, doubts, secrets. "How did you know about these?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Ellie's smile was sad. "I was 13 and nosy. I found him writing once and asked what it was. He made me promise never to tell anyone. Said some things needed to stay private, even from those we love most." She touched her mother's hand. "I'm sorry, Mom. I thought you knew." Margaret traced her finger over Walter's words, the intimate thoughts of a man she'd slept beside for decades, now revealed as a stranger. "Let's see what he was hiding," she said. Margaret's hands trembled as she spread the 5 leather journals across Walter's desk. They were arranged chronologically, the oldest dating back 15 years, the newest ending just weeks before Walter's diagnosis. The physical evidence of a secret life, or at least a secret self, that had existed alongside their marriage. "I can't," Margaret whispered, her fingers hovering over the most recent volume. This feels like a violation. Ellie's expression was gentle but firm. Dad's gone, Mom. And if there's something in here that explains why he gave the house to Camilla, don't we deserve to know? Margaret closed her eyes briefly. The Walter she knew, or thought she knew, would never have kept secrets from her. But the Walter she knew would never have signed away their home without telling her either. "You read first," she said finally. "Tell me if there's anything I need to see." Ellie nodded, taking the most recent journal. She settled into the window seat, the afternoon light catching the gold of her hair, so like Walter's had been in his youth. Margaret watched her daughter's expression as she read, the furrowed concentration giving way periodically to surprise, confusion, and once, a soft gasp. "Mom," Ellie said after nearly an hour, "you need to see this." She turned the journal around, pointing to an entry dated just before the trust was signed. Margaret took the book, her librarian's instinct to handle it carefully at war with her, desire to understand what it contained. Walter's neat handwriting filled the page. "June says I'm overthinking this, but what choice do I have? The practice is stable now, but if anyone ever connects those early transactions back to me, everything could collapse. Camilla's been dropping hints about real estate licenses and property transfers again. She knows something, or suspects at least. Perhaps this is the cleanest solution, giving her what she wants to protect what I've built. Margaret would understand, if she knew everything. But how can I tell her now after all these years? Some secrets are meant to stay buried. The house has always been her heart's home, mine too. But the cost of keeping it, of keeping everything I built, may be higher than I anticipated." Margaret stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. What early transactions was Walter referring to? What did Camilla know or suspect? And June. Why was June advising Walter about secrets he kept from his own wife? "There's more," Ellie said, taking the journal back and flipping forward several pages. "This is from 2 days after he signed the trust. It's done." Langston seemed surprised but didn't ask questions, the benefit of old friendships. Margaret was visiting Ellie, which made the timing easier. Camilla looked triumphant, of course. I wonder if she truly understands what she's taking on. The house isn't just property. It's the repository of everything, good and bad. Perhaps that's fitting in its way. June says I'm being melodramatic, that plenty of men make financial arrangements their wives don't know about. But this feels different. This feels like betrayal, even if it's meant to protect. I need to tell Margaret something before it's too late. But how do I begin to explain choices made decades ago? How do I tell her that everything, our life, this house, was built on sand? Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, emotions crashing. Through her like waves, confusion, hurt, anger, and beneath it all, a terrible sense of foolishness. How could she have been married to this man for 40 years and not known these thoughts existed inside him? "There are references to June throughout," Ellie continued, her voice careful. "And something about financial problems from before I was born. A foreclosure threat?" Margaret shook her head. "We never faced foreclosure. Walter's practice was successful from the beginning." Ellie hesitated. "Are you sure? Because there's an entry here from 10 years ago talking about the second time June saved us and how he could never repay that debt." Something cold settled in Margaret's stomach. June, her oldest friend. June, who had been there through everything, Walter's career milestones, the children's births, family holidays. June, who had always been just a little too comfortable in their home, who knew where everything was kept, who sometimes shared glances with Walter that Margaret had attributed to decades of friendship. "I need to see June," Margaret said, closing the journal with a decisive snap. "Mom, maybe we should read more first." "No." Margaret stood, suddenly needing movement, action. "I've spent weeks being told what my husband thought, what he wanted, what he decided without me. I'm done with secondhand revelations. I want answers directly from someone who's still alive to give them. June lived just 3 blocks away, in a craftsman bungalow filled with plants and mismatched furniture, the cheerful chaos of a woman who'd never had to accommodate a husband's preferences. When she opened the door to find Margaret on her porch, her smile faltered slightly. "Margaret, I was just about to call you. How did the hearing go?" "May I come in?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier than she felt. June's eyes narrowed slightly, but she stepped back, gesturing Margaret inside. "Of course. Tea?" "No." Margaret remained standing in June's cluttered living room. "I want to know what Walter meant when he wrote that you saved us from foreclosure. Twice." June froze, then slowly set down the tea kettle she'd been filling. "You found his journals. Why did my husband discuss our financial problems with you instead of me?" Margaret asked, the hurt making her voice sharp. "Why does he write about debts he could never repay?" June sighed deeply, sinking into her floral armchair. "Sit down, Margaret, please." Margaret reluctantly perched on the edge of the sofa, her back straight as a ruler. "I'm listening." "It wasn't what you're thinking," June began, then corrected herself. "Not entirely, anyway. Walter was proud. You know that better than anyone. When the practice hit rough patches, he couldn't bear to worry you." "What rough patches?" Margaret demanded. "He never mentioned any financial difficulties." June's laugh was soft, sad. "Of course he didn't. That was Walter. The first time was right after David was born. The recession hit his clients hard, and suddenly no one could afford a lawyer. You were home with a newborn, exhausted, and Walter. Walter would rather have died than tell you he couldn't provide. So he came to you," Margaret said flatly. "I had inheritance money sitting in the bank," June shrugged. "It wasn't complicated, just a loan between friends. And the second time—" June's hesitation was almost imperceptible. "About 15 years ago. There was a bad investment, something with a client's development project. Walter got in deeper than he meant to." Margaret remembered that period. Walter, working late, distracted at dinner, taking calls at odd hours. She'd attributed it to a difficult case. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, hating the plaintive note in her voice. "Because you would have forgiven him," June said simply. "And Walter couldn't forgive himself for risking your security. The house was leveraged, Margaret. All of it was at risk." Margaret thought of the home she'd poured her heart into for decades, the careful budgeting she'd done to maintain it, believing they were building something secure. All the while, Walter had been gambling with its foundation. "What does this have to do with Camilla?" she asked. "The journals mentioned protecting her from what he did. What did Walter do?" June rose, moving to the window. Outside, rain had begun to fall, pattering against the glass. "That's not my story to tell." "Don't you dare," Margaret snapped, her voice sharper than June had ever heard it. "Don't you dare hide behind discretion now, after all these years of knowing things about my marriage that I didn't know myself." June turned, her expression pained. "Walter made some arrangements during that difficult period. Cut corners with client funds to cover the investment losses. Nothing criminal, exactly, but certainly not ethical. Camilla found something, paperwork maybe, or overheard something. I don't know the details, but she leveraged it." "Blackmail," Margaret said, the word bitter on her tongue. "My daughter-in-law blackmailed my husband for our house. Or Walter bought her silence with the one thing she'd always wanted," June countered. "Either way, the result is the same." Margaret's mind was spinning, trying to reconcile the Walter she'd loved with this man who made desperate choices and secret arrangements. "And you?" she asked quietly. "What was your role in all this? The journals suggest more than friendship." June's cheeks flushed. "There was a time, years ago, when feelings became complicated. Nothing happened, Margaret. Nothing physical. But there were emotions neither of us knew how to handle. Walter chose you. He always chose you. But the debt between us remained. Margaret felt as if the floor beneath her had disappeared. Everything solid in her life, her marriage, her home, her friendships, suddenly revealed as illusion. "Did you know about the trust?" she asked. "Did you know what he was planning to do?" "Not until it was done," June replied, her gaze steady. "I would have told him not to do it. Despite everything, I would never have wanted you hurt this way." Margaret stood abruptly. "I need to go." "Margaret, wait. 40 years, Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. 40 years, and I didn't really know him at all." She left June's house in a daze, the rain soaking through her thin jacket. The 3-block walk home seemed to stretch endlessly, each step taking her further from the life she thought she'd lived and closer to a truth she wasn't sure she could bear. When she arrived home, she found Ellie in a shouting match with a man on their front porch. "You can't just walk in with your camera," Ellie was yelling. "This is private property." "Mrs. Whitmore authorized the photos," the man replied calmly, holding up his professional camera. "I have her signature right here." "My mother is Mrs. Whitmore," Ellie snapped. "He means Camilla," Margaret said, climbing the steps wearily. "She's exercising her rights as the new owner." The photographer looked between them uncomfortably. "I can come back another time," he offered. "No need," Margaret said, opening the front door. "Come in. Take your pictures. It doesn't matter anymore." "Mom!" Ellie protested, following her inside. "You can't just give up." Margaret turned, rain dripping from her hair onto the polished entryway floor, the floor she'd waxed by hand every spring for 40 years. "I'm not giving up," she said quietly. "I'm seeing clearly for the first time. This house, this marriage, this life I thought was mine, it was all built on secrets and compromises I never agreed to. Walter betrayed me long before he signed that trust. I knew Dad was updating his estate plan. The details weren't clear to me." Margaret watched her son, seeing the boy who'd always chosen the path of least resistance. Even now, facing his mother's potential displacement, he couldn't bring himself to take a side. "Your Honor," Patricia interjected, "we'd like to request a continuance to allow time for additional witnesses to be deposed, including June Abernathy, who appears prominently in Mr. Whitmore's journals." Judge Langston nodded. "I'll grant a 2-week continuance. In the meantime, I'd like to review these journals in chambers." She fixed Camilla with a penetrating look. "Mrs. Whitmore, Camilla, I must caution you against taking any actions regarding the property until this matter is resolved. No listings, no appraisals, no photographers." Ellis leaned over to whisper something to Camilla, whose lips tightened into a thin line. "Of course, Your Honor," she said smoothly. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret found herself face to face with Camilla in the narrow hallway. The younger woman's composure had returned, but there was a new wariness in her eyes. "Was it worth it?" Camilla asked quietly. "Dragging Walter's reputation through the mud? Was the house worth destroying our family?" Margaret countered. Camilla's laugh was soft, bitter. "Family? Is that what you call it? The polite dinners where Walter dominated every conversation while you sat silently. The way David was never quite good enough? You've been so busy preserving appearances that you never saw what was happening beneath the surface." Before Margaret could respond, David appeared between them. "Stop it, both of you," he said, his voice strained. "This isn't helping anyone." "David," Camilla took his arm possessively. "We should go. We have that appointment." But David shook her hand off, something he'd never done before. "I need to speak with my mother, alone." Camilla's eyes widened, slightly. "David, remember what we discussed?" "I'll meet you at the car." His tone left no room for argument. With a last sharp glance at Margaret, Camilla retreated down the hallway, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Ellie approached from the opposite direction, her face streaked with tears. "Mom, I don't know if I can do this anymore. Reading Dad's words in court, watching everyone's faces. It feels like we're just burning everything down." Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. "Sometimes fire is cleansing, Ellie." "Is it?" Ellie gestured helplessly. "Or are we just left with ashes?" The question hung between them, unanswerable. Margaret turned back to David, seeing something unfamiliar in his face. Resolution, perhaps, or at least the beginnings of it. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "There are things about Dad, about the trust. Things you need to know." "What things?" Margaret asked, suddenly wary of more revelations. David glanced around the courthouse hallway. "Not here. Meet me tomorrow morning at the River Cafe, 8 o'clock. He started to turn away, then hesitated. "Mom, what you said in there about Dad being afraid, it's more complicated than you think?" "Everything about your father seems to be more complicated than I thought," Margaret replied. David's smile was sad, fleeting. "Maybe that's the one thing we can all agree on." He squeezed her hand briefly. 8 o'clock, come, alone. As he walked away to join Camilla, his shoulders set in a new tension, Margaret felt the first stirrings of hope beneath her anger. Her son was finally choosing a side, or at least questioning the one he'd been on. "Do you trust him?" Ellie asked skeptically. Margaret watched David's retreating figure, remembering the little boy who'd once hidden a broken vase in his closet for weeks rather than admit he'd been playing ball in the house. "No," she said simply, "but I'll listen to what he has to say." The River Cafe sat perched on the bank of the Cooper River, its wide windows reflecting the morning light. Margaret arrived early, choosing a corner table with a view of both the entrance and the water. She ordered coffee and watched sailboats cutting white paths through the blue, wondering which version of her son would appear. The David who'd spent decades avoiding conflict, or the man who'd finally shaken off Camilla's. Grip in the courthouse hallway. At 8 precisely, David pushed through the door. His punctuality, at least, was Walter's legacy. He spotted her immediately, hesitating only briefly before threading his way between tables. "Mom." He leaned down, kissing her cheek awkwardly, before sliding into the opposite chair. He looked exhausted, the skin beneath his eyes bruised with sleeplessness. "Did you tell Camilla you were meeting me?" Margaret asked, pushing a menu toward him. David shook his head. "I said I had an early client breakfast." His fingers drummed nervously against the tabletop. She wouldn't understand. Understand? What exactly? What I'm about to tell you. He looked up as a waitress approached, ordering coffee without consulting the menu. When they were alone again, Margaret folded her hands deliberately, the way she had when David was small and in trouble. "I'm listening." David drew a deep breath. "Dad was dying long before any of us knew." Margaret froze. "What?" The official diagnosis came 3 months ago, but he'd been having symptoms for over a year. Unexplained weight loss, night sweats, fatigue. He made me go with him to the first appointment, swore me to secrecy. David's gaze dropped to his hands. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4 by the time they caught it. The doctor gave him maybe 6 months. Why wouldn't he tell me? Margaret whispered, though she already knew the answer. Walter, ever the protector, ever the controller. He was going to, Mom. He just wanted to. Arrange things first. David hesitated as his coffee arrived, waiting until the waitress retreated. The trust was part of that, but not the way you think. Margaret felt cold despite the sunlight streaming through the windows. Tell me. You remember the Harrison Development Project? About 15 years ago? Margaret nodded slowly. The golf community west of the city. It ran into environmental problems. It wasn't just environmental problems, David said. Dad had invested client funds, trust accounts he was managing, without proper authorization. When the project collapsed, he had to scramble to replace the money before anyone noticed. That's when June loaned him money, Margaret murmured, pieces falling into place. Yes, but there was more. David's voice dropped. He had to falsify some documents, backdate some authorizations. It wasn't legal, Mom. If it had been discovered, he could have lost his license, maybe even faced criminal charges. Margaret tried to reconcile this with the Walter she knew, the man who lectured their children about integrity, who built his reputation on ethical practice. How do you know all this? She asked. I was working at the firm that summer, remember? Right after law school. I saw some things that didn't add up. Dad explained it as a one-time emergency, swore it would never happen again. David's smile was bitter. I believed him because I wanted to, because he was Walter Whitmore, and Walter Whitmore didn't make those kinds of mistakes. And Camilla? How does she fit into this? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David's face tightened. Last year, she was helping a client research property histories for a potential development. She came across records from the Harrison project, inconsistencies in the filings, Dad's name on documents he shouldn't have signed. She confronted him? Not exactly. David rubbed his eyes. She asked me about it first, very casually. When I deflected, she went directly to Dad. Not with threats, but with concerns about how such revelations might affect our family name, my career prospects, your standing in the community. Margaret could picture it perfectly. Camilla's practiced sympathy, her suggestions framed as helpful solutions. Never a direct threat, just the shadow of one. When Dad got the diagnosis, David continued, Camilla stepped up her concerns. She started talking about family security, about protecting assets from medical expenses. She suggested the trust as a way to, what did she call it? Secure her future while protecting our legacy. And Walter agreed. It wasn't a question. He was scared, Mom, not just of dying, but of leaving behind a tarnished name. Camilla convinced him this was the cleanest solution. Give her what she wanted, and she'd ensure the Harrison situation remained buried. David's voice cracked slightly. I was there when they made the deal, in his study. I should have said something, should have stopped it, but you were afraid too, Margaret finished for him. David nodded, shame evident in his slumped shoulders. I've never stood up to either of them, Dad or Camilla. I've spent my whole life taking the path of least resistance. A sound from the nearby booth caught Margaret's attention. She turned to find Ellie standing there, face ashen, phone clutched in her hand. Ellie? What are you doing here? I followed you, Ellie admitted. I was worried about what David might say. I've been sitting over there the whole time. Her gaze shifted to her brother, hardening. You knew. All this time you knew what Dad did, what Camilla was doing, and you said nothing. David flinched. Ellie, it wasn't that simple. It's exactly that simple, she snapped. You chose your comfort over Mom's home, over the truth. That's enough, Margaret said firmly. Sit down, Ellie. Both of you need to lower your voices. Ellie slid reluctantly into the booth beside her mother, still glaring at David. So what happens now? We have proof that Camilla coerced Dad. We can fight this. Margaret absorbed this, turning over the implications. She now had what she'd been searching for. Evidence that the trust had been signed under duress, leverage to potentially overturn Camilla's claim. Yet the victory felt hollow. If we present this in court, she said slowly. Everything comes out. Walter's financial misconduct, the falsified documents, his reputation, everything he built. Who cares about his reputation? Ellie demanded. He lied to you for decades, Mom. He betrayed your trust. And then he gave away your home to save himself. To save all of us, David corrected quietly. Dad genuinely believed he was protecting the family. Protecting you, Mom, from knowing what he'd done. Margaret gazed out at the river, its surface deceptively peaceful. Was any of it real? She asked, more to herself than her children. Our marriage? Our life together? Of course it was, David insisted. Dad loved you more than anything. That's why the house mattered so much to him, because it mattered to you. Movement near the cafe entrance caught Margaret's eye. Liam and Nora stood awkwardly by the hostess station, scanning the tables. Ellie followed her gaze and cursed softly. I was supposed to pick them up from their dads. They must have taken an Uber when I didn't show. She waved them over. Liam approached first, gangly at 16, his expression wary. Mom? Grandma? Is everything okay? We're fine, honey, Ellie said too brightly. Just having breakfast with Uncle David. Nora, 13 and observant, studied their faces. You guys look weird. Are you fighting about the house again? Margaret watched her grandchildren, Walter's legacy in flesh and blood, innocent of the complexities swirling. Around them, what would they think if they knew the truth about their grandfather? What impact would these revelations have on their understanding of family, of trust, of integrity? We're discussing some complicated grown-up issues, Margaret said carefully. Nothing for you to worry about. Is it true that Aunt Camilla gets the house now? Liam asked bluntly. That's what Dad said. Margaret hesitated, suddenly seeing the situation through her grandchildren's eyes. The home where they'd celebrated birthdays and Christmases, the garden where Walter had taught Liam to plant tomatoes, the kitchen where Nora had learned to bake, cookies, all of it reduced to legal documents and exposed secrets. We're still figuring things out, she said finally. It's complicated. Why does it have to be complicated? Nora asked with the directness of youth. It's just a house. Just a house. Margaret felt something shift inside her at those simple words. Ellie and David were both watching her, waiting for her reaction, waiting to see which direction the battle would take. Your grandfather made some mistakes, Margaret said carefully. Choices that had consequences. We're all trying to figure out the right thing to do now. Is the right thing fighting Aunt Camilla? Liam asked. Because it's making everyone miserable. Out of the mouths of babes, Margaret thought. She looked at David, seeing clearly for the first time how haunted he was by his complicity, how torn between loyalty to his wife and to his mother. She looked at Ellie, fierce in her protection, but exhausted by the constant conflict. And she looked at her grandchildren, watching their family fracture over bricks and mortar. I don't know what the right thing is yet, Margaret admitted. But I think it's time I figured it out for myself, not just react to what Walter or Camilla decided. She gathered her purse, suddenly needing space to think. David, thank you for telling me the truth. It couldn't have been easy. She touched Ellie's shoulder gently. Take the kids to breakfast. We'll talk later. Where are you going? Ellie asked. Margaret stood, feeling strangely lighter despite everything she'd learned. To decide what justice really means in this situation, and what kind of legacy I want to leave behind. This changes everything, Patricia Hollingsworth said, spreading David's signed statement across her mahogany desk. Afternoon sunlight slanted through Venetian blinds, striping the confession with bars of light and shadow. Undue influence is clear here. Blackmail, essentially. The trust should be voidable on these grounds alone. Margaret sat across from her, Walter's journal open in her lap. She'd spent the morning copying relevant entries, creating a paper trail of her husband's fear and manipulation. The words blurred before her eyes, no longer shocking, just sad. "If we present this," she asked quietly, "how public does it become?" Patricia's expression softened with understanding. "Court records are generally public. While we could request certain documents be sealed, the basic allegations would be accessible. Walter's professional misconduct would become known." "And the impact on David? He's implicated in the cover-up." "Minimal legal exposure given the time elapsed," Patricia assured her, "but professionally. Charleston is a small legal community. There would be whispers." Margaret traced the edge of the journal, feeling the worn leather beneath her fingertips. For weeks, she'd wanted nothing but ammunition to fight Camilla. Now that she had it, victory seemed hollow. "We have the next hearing in 3 days," Patricia prompted gently. "I need to know what you want to do, Margaret." "I need more time," Margaret said, rising abruptly. "I'll call you tomorrow." Outside, Charleston's humidity wrapped around her like a damp blanket. Margaret walked without destination, her mind churning with possibilities. She could fight, expose Walter's sins, shame Camilla, reclaim her house. She could surrender, accept the loss, preserve what remained of Walter's reputation, allow David to maintain his carefully constructed life. Neither option felt right. Her phone buzzed with a text from June. "We need to talk. Coffee at my place? Important." 20 minutes later, Margaret sat in June's cluttered sunroom, surrounded by ferns and overgrown orchids. Their friendship hung by a thread, decades of trust, unraveled by revelations of secrets kept. "David called me," June said without preamble, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs. "He told me what he confessed." Margaret accepted the coffee but didn't drink. "Did you know about Walter's terminal diagnosis too? Another secret I wasn't privy to?" June winced. "No, that I didn't know. But Margaret, I did know about the trust. Walter told me after he signed it. And you said nothing." The betrayal was no longer a sharp pain, but a dull, expected ache. "He swore he would tell you himself. Said he just needed time to figure out how." June settled into her wicker chair, looking suddenly older. "I believed him, or wanted to. By the time I realized he wasn't going to tell you, he was too sick, and I couldn't bring myself to destroy what peace you had left together." Margaret studied her oldest friend, the woman who had held her secrets, kept her husband's. Confidences blurred the lines of loyalty in ways Margaret was still untangling. "What would you do in my position? Fight or concede?" June considered this, her gardener's hands wrapped around her mug. "That depends on what you're really fighting for, Margaret. Is it the house? Or is it the feeling that you've been erased?" The question resonated uncomfortably. Margaret stared out at June's wild, thriving garden, so different from Walter's meticulously planned landscaping. "If you go to court with David's confession," June continued, "you might win the house. But at what cost? David's relationship with Camilla will implode. His standing at the firm will be compromised. Even Ellie might struggle with Walter's legacy being so publicly tarnished. So I should just let Camilla take everything? After what she did?" "I'm not saying that," June replied. "I'm saying there might be another way to seek justice, one that doesn't burn down the village to save it." Before Margaret could respond, her phone buzzed with Ellie's number. "Hello? Mom, you need to come home right now." Ellie's voice was tight with fury. "Camilla is here with a realtor, and she's brought papers, some kind of eviction notice." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "I'll be right there." June caught her expression. "What's happened?" "Camilla's escalating," Margaret said grimly, already gathering her purse. "She's serving me with eviction papers. She can't do that. The judge specifically said, apparently she's done waiting for the legal process." Margaret headed for the door, a cold clarity settling over her. It seems we're all drawing lines in the sand now. When Margaret arrived home, she found chaos. Ellie stood in the foyer, physically blocking a middle-aged man with a camera from proceeding further. A woman in a blazer, presumably the realtor, was speaking urgently into her phone, while Camilla stood by the staircase, arms crossed, a manila envelope tucked under one elbow. "What is going on here?" Margaret demanded, closing the front. Doctor firmly behind her. Camilla stepped forward, her smile tight. "Margaret, I was hoping to handle this discreetly before you returned. I've engaged Meridian Realty to begin preliminary marketing assessments for the property." The judge explicitly prohibited any actions regarding the house until the case is resolved, Margaret reminded her. The judge issued a caution, not an order, Camilla countered smoothly. And circumstances have changed. She extended the envelope. "I've received concerning information about potential damage to the property. As the legal owner, I have a responsibility to protect my investment." Margaret left the envelope untouched. "What concerning information?" "Anonymous reports of erratic behavior, destruction of property." Camilla's gaze slid meaningfully to Walter's study. "Removal of documents that belong to the estate." Ellie stepped forward. "That's ridiculous. Mom hasn't damaged anything." The realtor cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Whitmore, Camilla, perhaps? We should reschedule when things are less tense." "That won't be necessary, Diane." Camilla's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "As I explained, my mother-in-law is understandably emotional during this difficult time, which is precisely why we need to expedite matters." Margaret understood with sudden clarity what was happening. David must have told Camilla about their meeting, about his confession. Now she was moving quickly, trying to establish control of the property before Margaret could use the new evidence. "Diane, is it?" Margaret addressed the realtor directly. "I suggest you leave now. This property is under legal dispute, and any participation in marketing, it could expose you to liability." The realtor hesitated, looking between the two women. "She's bluffing," Camilla said flatly. "The trust is clear." "Am I?" Margaret turned to the photographer. "Sir, are you aware that photographing private property without the occupant's consent could constitute trespassing in South Carolina?" The man lowered his camera, glancing uncertainly at the realtor. "We'll reschedule," the realtor decided, gathering her portfolio. "Camilla, I'll call you later." As they retreated to the door, Camilla's composure slipped for the first time. "This is just delaying the inevitable, Margaret. I know what you and David are planning. It won't work." "What exactly am I planning, Camilla?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious what David had revealed. "Leveraging family secrets for personal gain," Camilla hissed, dropping all pretense of civility. "Using Walter's private writings to smear his memory. Did it ever occur to you that maybe he left you out of the trust for a reason? That maybe 40 years of silent compliance wasn't actually what he needed in a wife?" The barb found its mark, but Margaret didn't flinch. "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps I should have questioned him more, challenged him earlier. That's a mistake I won't repeat. With you." Ellie stepped forward, physically placing herself between the women. "You need to leave, Camilla. Now." Camilla tossed the envelope onto the entryway table. "Formal notice. You have 30 days, Margaret. Whatever your lawyer says, possession is 9/10 of the law. Once I take physical control of the property, your uphill battle becomes a vertical climb." With that, she swept out, closing the door with exaggerated gentleness behind her. Ellie immediately snatched up the envelope, tearing it open. "This can't be legal. The case is still pending." She scanned the document, her expression darkening. "She's claiming urgent property maintenance issues require immediate intervention. It's all fabricated, but it looks official." "She's panicking," Margaret observed, a strange calm settling over her. "David must have told her he confessed to me. She knows her leverage is slipping." Then we need to move fast, Ellie insisted. Call Patricia. Submit David's statement. End this now. Margaret walked slowly through the foyer into the living room, seeing the house with new eyes. Not as the shrine to her marriage she'd preserved for decades, but as the repository of complicated truths, some beautiful, some ugly, all part of the tapestry of their lives. Mom? Ellie followed her, concerned. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time I stopped reacting and started acting. Margaret moved to the built-in bookshelves, running her fingers along leather-bound volumes that had sat untouched for years. Bring me those empty boxes from the attic, Ellie. The ones we stored after the Christmas decorations were reorganized. You're not seriously packing, are you? Mom, we can fight this. I'm not surrendering, Margaret clarified. I'm preparing. There's a difference. She turned to her daughter, something new in her expression, determination untempered by doubt. Camilla thinks she knows what I'll do next because she believes she knows who I am. The compliant wife, the silent partner, the woman who accepts what she's given. It's time to show her how wrong she is. Ellie studied her mother, seeing something shift and strengthen before her eyes. What are you planning? Margaret's smile held no warmth. First, I'm going to have tea with your brother's wife. One final conversation before I decide how much of Walter's legacy deserves to survive. Margaret arranged the silver tea service with deliberate precision. Walter's grandmother's teapot gleamed in the afternoon light, flanked by the Wedgwood cups she reserved for special occasions. The lemon squares were cut into perfect diamonds, arranged on a crystal platter alongside cucumber sandwiches with the crusts meticulously removed, a performance of domesticity so flawless it bordered on parody. Mom, I still think this is a terrible idea, Ellie said from the doorway, watching Margaret adjust a linen napkin. Having Camilla here, alone, after everything she's done? Not alone, Margaret corrected, with me. You know what I mean. No lawyers, no witnesses, just giving her another opportunity to manipulate the situation. Margaret straightened, surveying the tableau she'd created. I've spent 40 years being manipulated, Ellie. I think I've developed an immunity. The doorbell chimed precisely at 3. Margaret smoothed her silk blouse. Dove gray, simple, expensive. One of the few items she'd bought for herself without considering Walter's preferences. I'll get it. Camilla stood on the porch looking polished but wary, like a diplomat, entering hostile territory. Her cream suit was impeccably tailored, her smile professional. Only the tightness around her eyes betrayed her tension. Margaret, thank you for the invitation. She extended a small gift bag. I brought those macarons you admired at the charity luncheon last year. A peace offering, or perhaps just good manners. Margaret accepted it with a nod. Come in. I've set up in the sunroom. Should I expect David or lawyers? Camilla asked, following Margaret through the house. Just us, Margaret replied. Some conversations need to happen woman to woman. The sunroom glowed with late afternoon light, the tea service casting delicate shadows across the table. Margaret gestured to the chair opposite hers. Please, sit. Camilla complied, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap. The picture of a daughter-in-law paying a respectful visit. Both women understood the charade. Margaret poured the tea with steady hands. Lemon? Sugar? Just lemon, thank you. They observed the rituals of politeness, comments on the weather, compliments on the pastries, careful sips from fine china, 2 queens circling on a chessboard, measuring each other's defenses. I expect you're wondering why I asked you here, Margaret said finally, setting down her cup. I assumed it was to negotiate. Camilla's voice was cool, businesslike. After David's revelations, in a manner of speaking. Margaret leaned forward slightly. I wanted us to talk honestly, without lawyers or family members interfering. I know everything now, Camilla, about Walter's financial mistakes, about how you discovered them and used that knowledge to secure the house, about the ultimatum you gave him when he was diagnosed. Camilla didn't flinch. Is that what David told you? An ultimatum? She shook her head. Men have such a flair for drama. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. Blackmail is a strange sort of business. I prefer to think of it as leveraging available resources. Camilla selected a lemon square, her movements deliberate. Walter understood the language of transaction. It was the clearest way to communicate. Margaret studied her daughter-in-law, this woman who had married into their family a decade ago and remained an elegant enigma. Always pleasant, always appropriate, never quite belonging. What I don't understand, Margaret said, is why the house specifically. With Walter's resources, he could have offered you money, investments, other properties. Why this house? Something flickered in Camilla's eyes. A moment of genuine emotion breaking through the polished surface. Because it's the heart of everything. The seat of the Whitmore legacy. The place where family history is written. Her smile was small, bitter. And because you loved it so much. The honesty was startling. You wanted to hurt me? I wanted to matter, Camilla corrected. 10 years, Margaret. 10 years of perfect holiday dinners where my contributions were politely ignored. 10 years of being treated like an accessory to David rather than a member of the family. 10 years of watching Walter dote on Ellie while barely acknowledging his son or me. Margaret felt a flicker of recognition. How many times had she observed Walter's preference for their daughter, his subtle dismissal of David's accomplishments? How often had she silently compensated, giving David extra attention, to balance Walter's favoritism? And yet, had she ever truly welcomed Camilla? The house was symbolic, Camilla continued, her composure returning. The ultimate recognition that I'm not just passing through the Whitmore family, that I've secured my place. At my expense. Yes. Camilla didn't bother denying it. Though I never planned to leave you homeless, despite what you might think, the trust guarantees your right to live here. At your discretion, Margaret pointed out, which you've already moved to revoke with those eviction papers. Camilla waved this away. A legal maneuver. I knew you'd found leverage through David. I needed to establish control before you could use it. So you admit you were afraid. Cautious, Camilla corrected. The same way you've been gathering ammunition, journals, testimonials, David's confession. We're not so different, Margaret. We both protect what we value. Margaret considered this, surprised by the ring of truth in it. Perhaps. But what I valued was my marriage, my family. What do you value, Camilla? The house itself? Or what it represents? Security. Camilla's answer came without hesitation. Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up with nothing? To watch your mother cycle through men who promised stability then vanished? To claw your way into respectability through sheer determination? She gestured around the sunroom. This house represents everything I never had, and everything I swore my children would have. Permanence, legacy, belonging. You don't have children, Margaret observed quietly. Pain flashed across Camilla's face, so quickly Margaret almost missed it. Not yet, but I will, and when I do, they won't grow up wondering if the floor beneath them might disappear at any moment. The revelation hung between them. Camilla's driving motivation, the depth of her determination suddenly cast in a new light. Not simple greed, but something more primal, more understandable, if no less destructive. You know, Margaret said, refilling their cups, for 40 years I poured everything into this house, into Walter's career, into creating the perfect environment for our family. I believed that was my role, to maintain the foundation so Walter could build his legacy. The devoted wife, Camilla murmured, the ideal Walter needed. The ideal I thought I needed to be, Margaret corrected. But these past weeks have shown me how much of myself I surrendered in the process. How much I allowed Walter to define who I was and what I deserved. Camilla leaned forward slightly. Are you suggesting I did you a favor by exposing Walter's betrayal? No, but perhaps you forced a reckoning that was long overdue. Margaret met her gaze steadily. You're not the only one who's felt invisible in this family, Camilla. The difference is, I chose my invisibility. I mistook it for virtue. Camilla's expression shifted, something like reluctant respect crossing her features. I never saw you this way, beneath the perfect hostess, the supportive wife. I thought you were content. I was. But contentment built on partial truths is a house of cards. Margaret sipped her tea, the faint bitterness complementing their conversation. David tells me you've been considering selling once you secure full control. The market is excellent right now, Camilla replied, professional mask sliding back into place. From an investment perspective, this isn't about investment, it's about power. Margaret set down her cup with a decisive clink. You achieved your goal, Camilla. You matter. You've made your mark on the Whitmore legacy. But ask yourself, what legacy are you creating? One of manipulation and force, or something more lasting? Camilla's eyes narrowed. Is this where you threaten to expose Walter's financial misdeeds if I don't surrender the house? Because I've prepared for that contingency. I'm sure you have. You're nothing if not thorough. Margaret rose, crossing to the window that overlooked Walter's garden. But I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to offer clarity. Clarity? I could fight you in court. With David's testimony and Walter's journals, I have a strong case for undue influence. I might win. But the process would destroy what remains of this family. Walter's reputation, David's marriage to you, perhaps, even his career. Margaret turned, facing Camilla directly. Is that what you want? Total victory amidst total destruction? Camilla stared at her, calculation evident in her gaze. What are you suggesting? That perhaps there's a path forward that doesn't require either of us to lose everything to gain something. Margaret returned to her seat. I won't surrender this house without a fight, Camilla, but I'm beginning to question whether fighting for it is the best use of whatever time I have left. You're proposing a compromise? Camilla sounded skeptical. I'm proposing a conversation about what we both truly need versus what we think we want. Margaret held her gaze. About what kind of women we choose to be, ones who tear down or ones who build up. Camilla's laugh was soft, almost genuine. Ever the diplomat, Margaret, even now. Not diplomacy, clarity. For the first time in decades, I'm seeing this situation, this family, without Walter's shadow coloring everything. Margaret's smile was sad but determined. I'm offering you one chance to reconstruct this arrangement before I make my final decision about court. And if I refuse? Then prepare for a very public examination of Walter's professional conduct, your methods of securing the trust, and the impact on everyone involved. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. I have nothing left to lose, Camilla. My illusions are already shattered. Can you say the same? Camilla was silent for a long moment, reassessing the woman across from her. No longer the grieving widow, easily dismissed, but a formidable opponent who had found her footing. I'll consider your suggestion, she said finally, rising. To leave. Though I make no promises. Margaret nodded, standing as well. That's all I ask. Consideration. Sometimes that's where wisdom begins. As she showed Camilla to the door, Margaret felt a strange lightness. Not the relief of victory, nothing was resolved, but the freedom of speaking her truth without fear or apology. For too long, she had orbited around Walter's sun, reflecting his light rather than generating her own. Now, facing the possible loss of everything she'd built with him, she was discovering her own gravity. "One last thing," Camilla said, pausing at the threshold. "You accused me of manipulating Walter, but ask yourself, Margaret, were you any different? Didn't you also shape yourself to be exactly what he needed, securing your position through perfect compliance rather than blackmail?" The question hung in the air between them, uncomfortable in its insight. "Perhaps," Margaret acknowledged. "The difference is, I'm finally ready to stop." Part 9. The Public Reckoning. The invitations went out a week after Margaret's tea with Camilla. Simple cream cards with elegant script. "The family of Walter Whitmore requests your presence for a memorial addendum to honor the fullness of a life, including its complexities. Sunday, 3 p.m. Reception to follow." Patricia Hollingsworth called within an hour of receiving hers. "Margaret, what exactly are you planning?" Her voice carried equal parts concern and confusion. "We have the court date in 3 days. This timing is unusual." "I'm taking a different approach," Margaret replied, her tone serene as she arranged flowers in the dining room. "The legal battle is on hold for now." "On hold, but we have compelling evidence. David's testimony alone would destroy what remains of this family," Margaret finished. "Some things are more important than winning, Patricia." After a troubled silence, Patricia sighed. "It's your decision. But I hope you know what you're doing." June arrived the morning of the event with armloads of white hydrangeas and determined energy. "I still think this is either brilliance or madness," she said, arranging blooms in crystal vases. "Possibly both." "Life is rarely binary," Margaret replied, pinning up a collection of family photographs that spanned decades. Walter as a young lawyer, their wedding day, the children's graduations, grandchildren's birthdays. A visual timeline of a life, neither sanitized nor censored. Ellie appeared in the doorway, watching her mother with cautious admiration. "The caterers are here, and Liam wants to know if he can read his poem before or after you speak." "After, I think," Margaret decided. "A young voice to follow an old story. That feels right." The guests began arriving at 2:30. Colleagues from Walter's firm, neighbors who'd known them for decades, friends from the various spheres of their life. They moved through the house with subdued curiosity, studying the photographs, accepting glasses of wine, wondering aloud what this addendum might entail. David arrived early, pale but composed, standing awkwardly in the foyer until Margaret approached him. "I wasn't sure if you wanted me here," he admitted quietly. Margaret squeezed his hand. "You're my son. Of course I want you here." "Camilla won't come," he warned. "After your conversation. She's been different. Quieter. She said this is a trap set to humiliate her." "It's not about her," Margaret assured him. "Or you, or even me. It's about truth. Walter's truth. The full measure of the man, not just the edited version we've all preserved in amber." By 3:00, the house was full. Every chair filled, guests lining the walls of the living room, spilling into the dining room. Margaret moved through the crowd in a simple navy dress. No black this time, no widow's weeds. Just a woman ready to speak her truth. Judge Langston slipped in late, taking a position at the back of the room. Their eyes met briefly across the crowd. The judge nodded slightly, a gesture of respect if not yet understanding. At precisely 3:15, Margaret moved to the front of the room, the same spot where she'd delivered Walter's eulogy weeks earlier. This time she carried one of his journals. A murmur rippled through the crowd, then silence fell. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady. "When we gathered here after Walter's funeral, I spoke about my husband as I believed him to be. A pillar of integrity, a devoted father, a meticulous planner who left nothing to chance." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across familiar faces. That wasn't the whole truth. The tension in the room thickened. David shifted in his seat. June, standing near the French doors, gave Margaret an encouraging nod. In the weeks following Walter's death, I discovered journals he'd kept for years, private reflections he shared with no one, not even me. I learned that my husband of 40 years was a more complicated man than any of us knew. He made mistakes, serious ones. He cut corners when pressured. He kept secrets to protect his image. Margaret opened the journal, her fingers finding the marked page. But he also carried the weight of those choices heavily. She began to read, her librarian's voice bringing Walter's words to life. The house remains my greatest pride and my deepest shame. Built with Margaret's devotion, but maintained through compromises she knows nothing about. I tell myself I protected her by keeping the Harrison situation secret, but the truth is simpler and uglier. I protected myself from her disappointment. The foundation of our life together rests partly on quicksand, and now, facing mortality, I find myself making one final compromise to preserve what I can of this legacy. Will she forgive me when she discovers what I've done? I'm a coward for not giving her the chance to answer that question while I still live to hear it. A stillness had fallen over the room. In the corner, David had buried his face in his hands. Judge Langston was watching intently, her judicial neutrality giving way to something more human. Margaret closed the journal gently. Walter was right about one thing. I wish he'd given me the chance to answer that question while he was alive. I wish he'd trusted our marriage enough to show me his true self, mistakes, fears, and all. She moved away from the mantel, walking slowly toward the center of the room. But Walter wasn't unique in his fear. How many of us present the edited version of ourselves to those we love most? How many of us believe, deep down, that we must be perfect to be worthy? Her gaze found familiar faces in the crowd. Neighbors who'd projected perfect marriages while privately struggling. Colleagues who'd hidden financial difficulties behind country club memberships. Friends who'd masked illness or addiction behind social smiles. Walter's final act was to sign our family home over to our daughter-in-law, Camilla, a decision I knew nothing about until after his death. A murmur rippled through the room. Many had heard rumors, but few knew the details. His journals reveal that this choice came from a complex tangle of guilt, fear, and manipulation. I could fight this decision legally, and might well win. Margaret paused, letting the moment hang in the air. But what would victory mean? More secrets exposed, more pain inflicted, more division in a family already fracturing. Walter spent his life curating his image at the expense of honesty. I will not continue that legacy. David looked up, tears streaming openly down his face, for the first time since his father's death. The room had grown so quiet that Margaret could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, marking the seconds of this transformation. Instead, she continued, I choose to reclaim not the house, but the narrative. To acknowledge Walter Whitmore as he truly was, a brilliant, flawed, loving, fearful man who did his best and sometimes failed. A man worthy of love not despite his imperfections, but with them fully counted in the tally. Near the back of the room, there was a small commotion. Margaret looked up to see Camilla standing in the doorway, her face carefully composed, but her eyes wide with something like shock. Despite David's warning, she had come after all. Their gazes locked briefly across the crowded room. In that spirit, Margaret continued, I invite anyone who wishes to share their unedited memories of Walter, not just the polished anecdotes we exchange at funerals, but the full, messy truth of knowing him. What followed was unlike any memorial Margaret had ever attended. One by one, people rose to speak, Walter's law partner confessing how Walter had covered for him during a bout with alcoholism, a neighbor recounting Walter's furious reaction when their dog had ruined his prized rose bushes, followed by his sheepish apology the next day. a young associate describing Walter's merciless criticism and equally passionate mentorship. Throughout it all, Margaret stood steady, accepting each story, the flattering and the unflattering, as pieces of the whole. The Walter who emerged was more human than the saint of her eulogy, but somehow more beloved for his visibility. When the stories ebbed, Liam stepped forward, a crumpled paper in his hand. At 16, he was caught between boyhood and manhood, his voice occasionally cracking as he read the poem he'd written about family. Foundations aren't always what they seem. Stone can crack, wood can warp. But we stand anyway on imperfect ground, under changeable skies, building and rebuilding not. A perfect house, but a home for imperfect people who love anyway. His simple words broke something open in the room. David sobbed openly now, years of suppressed emotion finally finding release. Ellie moved to her son, embracing him with fierce pride. And at the back of the room, Margaret saw Camilla slip quietly outside, her composure finally cracking. As the formal portion of the gathering concluded and guests moved toward the dining room for refreshments, Judge Langston approached Margaret. "That," she said quietly, "was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever witnessed." Margaret smiled slightly. "Not exactly standard legal procedure." "No," the judge agreed. "Much braver than that." She studied Margaret thoughtfully. "Does this mean you're withdrawing your petition contesting the trust?" "I haven't decided. Yet. But I'm exploring alternatives to scorched earth." Judge Langston nodded. "If you change your approach, my door is open. Some situations require wisdom more than legal precedent." With a gentle squeeze of Margaret's arm, she moved away. June appeared at Margaret's side, tears in her eyes. "Walter would have hated every minute of this," she said with a watery laugh, "and needed it more than anyone." "I know," Margaret replied softly. Across the room, Ellie was watching her mother with a new expression. Not just love or concern, but profound respect. She made her way through the crowd, embracing Margaret tightly. "I thought you were giving up," she whispered. But this wasn't surrender at all. "No," Margaret agreed. "It was liberation." She looked around at the gathering, not awake anymore, not a battle line, but something new and unexpected. A community witnessing authentic healing. The house is just walls and roof, Ellie. The story we tell about ourselves, that's the real legacy. As the afternoon mellowed into evening and guests gradually departed, Margaret found herself standing alone in Walter's study. The journal lay open on his desk, its secrets now spoken aloud rather than hidden in leather binding. The weight she'd carried since his death, grief compounded by betrayal, had transformed into something lighter, not through forgetting, but through integration. She was replacing the journal in the drawer when her phone buzzed with a text message. The number was Camilla's. "We need to talk, tomorrow. Not about winning or losing, but about finding a better way forward. For all of us." Margaret read the message twice, surprised not by its content but by its timing. The public unveiling of Walter's journals, and her choice not to use them as legal weapons, had clearly affected Camilla more deeply than expected. "Yes," she texted back. "I think we do." She closed the drawer, sensing Walter's presence in the room not as the perfect husband she'd idealized, nor the betrayer she'd recently discovered, but as the complex man he'd truly been. For the first time since his death, she spoke aloud to him. "I would have forgiven you," she said softly. "If only you'd asked." Charleston's waterfront park embraced the Cooper River like a lover, its generous curve offering panoramic views of the harbor. Margaret arrived early, selecting a bench that faced the water, watching sailboats tack against the wind. A container ship moved with deliberate slowness toward the distant ocean, carrying its cargo to unknown shores. She hadn't told Ellie about this meeting. Her daughter would have insisted on coming, on protecting her from Camilla's manipulations. But Margaret no longer needed protection, not from Camilla, not from the truth, not even from loss. The memorial addendum had shifted something fundamental within her. At precisely noon, Camilla appeared, walking along the promenade with measured steps. She wore a simple linen dress rather than her usual tailored suit, her hair loose instead of rigidly styled. Small changes that hinted at larger ones beneath the surface. "Thank you for coming," Camilla said, settling beside Margaret on the bench. "No air kisses, no social pretense." "Your message intrigued me," Margaret replied. "A better way forward is something we both need, I think." Camilla gazed out at the harbor, gathering her thoughts. "I've never attended a memorial service like that before. So unvarnished. Truth often is. It made me realize something." Camilla turned slightly, facing Margaret directly. "I've spent my entire life fighting to belong somewhere, to secure my place. When I discovered Walter's financial indiscretions, I saw an opportunity to finally anchor myself in the Whitmore family permanently." Margaret nodded, waiting for her to continue. "What I didn't expect," Camilla admitted, "was how empty the victory would feel. Watching you stand there reading Walter's private thoughts, not to destroy him but to understand him." Her voice faltered slightly. "I realized I'd won the house but lost any hope of truly belonging. A pelican swooped low over the water, plunging suddenly to emerge with a fish wriggling in its beak. Nature's transaction, clean, direct, without malice. I'm prepared to relinquish my claim to the house," Camilla said finally. Margaret studied her daughter-in-law's face, searching for manipulation but finding only guarded vulnerability. "Why now?" "Because I want something different. Something that might actually satisfy what I've been seeking all along." Camilla reached into her bag, extracting a folder. "I've drafted a proposal. Not as a legal negotiation, but as a family matter." Margaret accepted the folder, opening it to find several typed pages. She scanned them slowly, her eyebrows rising, slightly as she absorbed the contents. "You're proposing to transfer the house back to me in exchange for public acknowledgement as a Whitmore trustee and the beach cottage at Sullivan's Island?" Camilla nodded. "The cottage has stood empty since Walter's parents died. It's smaller, but it has potential. And the trustee position would give me a legitimate role in managing the Whitmore family's affairs, transparently, this time." Margaret continued reading. "And this clause about David?" "He needs to be part of this resolution," Camilla said firmly. "To rebuild what's been damaged between us, between all of us. I've asked that he be the one to draft and file the new trust document." The proposal was unexpected, almost elegant in its balance of practical and symbolic concessions. Not a surrender, but a recalibration. Margaret closed the folder slowly. "What changed, Camilla? Beyond the memorial service?" Camilla's gaze returned to the harbor, where the container ship had now disappeared into the horizon. "David told me he was considering leaving me," she said quietly. "That he couldn't continue living between worlds, between loyalties. It made me realize that in fighting so hard for security, I was destroying the very thing that would provide it. My marriage, my place in the family." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way their previous conversations had never been. "And there's something else," Camilla added, her voice taking on a new quality, hesitant, almost shy. "Something I haven't told anyone yet, not even David." Her hand moved instinctively to her abdomen. "I'm pregnant, 8 weeks." Margaret felt the news like a physical touch. A grandchild, another branch on the Whitmore family tree. "Does David know?" Camilla shook her head. "I only confirmed it yesterday. I needed to resolve this situation first, to decide what kind of mother I want to be, what kind of family we can build. The revelation cast Camilla's proposal in a new light. Not just a negotiating tactic, but a genuine attempt to create a sustainable future. For herself, for her marriage, for the child that would bind them all together in new ways. The beach cottage needs extensive renovation, Margaret observed. It's been neglected for years. I know. I've already had an architect walk through it. A flash of the old Camilla, efficient, forward planning. The potential is there, and it would be ours, free and clear. Not taken, but given. Margaret considered this woman beside her, no longer simply an adversary, but a complex human being carrying Walter's grandchild, David's child, the newest Whitmore. Fighting her suddenly seemed not just pointless, but actively harmful to the future they would all share. I accept your proposal, Margaret said finally, with one addition. Which is? Full disclosure to David and Ellie. No more secrets. No more manipulations. We tell them everything. Your pregnancy, this agreement, the reasoning behind it. Camilla hesitated, then nodded. Agreed. Though I'd like to tell David about the baby privately. Of course. Margaret extended her hand, and Camilla took it. Not an embrace, not yet, but a connection. Tentative, genuine. There's a coffee shop around the corner, Margaret suggested. Why don't we revise this document together, then call David to meet us? I think he should hear this directly from both of us. An hour later, they sat in a quiet corner of the cafe, the revised agreement between them, untouched cappuccinos growing cold. When David arrived, his expression was guarded, eyes moving suspiciously between his mother and wife. What's going on? He asked, remaining standing. Mom? Camilla? Sit down, David, Margaret said gently. We have something important to discuss with you. As they explained the agreement, David's face registered disbelief, then cautious. Oh, when Camilla finally shared her pregnancy news, tears filled his eyes. The second time Margaret had seen her son cry in a week, after years of careful composure. You're really willing to give up the house? He asked Camilla, his voice thick with emotion. I'm willing to find a different kind of security, she corrected, her hand resting lightly on her stomach. One built on honesty, rather than leverage. David turned to Margaret. And you're okay with Camilla having a formal role in the family trust? I think it's appropriate, Margaret replied. She's a Whitmore now, David, and soon she'll be the mother of a Whitmore. It's time we all acknowledge that properly. When Ellie arrived 30 minutes later, summoned by Margaret's text, her suspicious glare at Camilla softened gradually as the agreement was explained. She studied the document carefully, attorney's mind searching for traps or loopholes. This is actually fair, she admitted finally, almost elegant in its balance. The last clause is the most important, Margaret pointed out. All parties acknowledge the importance of maintaining family relationships above material assets and commit to rebuilding trust through transparency and mutual respect. Legally unenforceable, Ellie noted. But morally binding, Camilla countered. Something passed between the two women. Not friendship, not yet, but a recognition. A possibility. Ellie's gaze shifted to Camilla's still flat abdomen, where her future niece or nephew grew, connecting them all irrevocably. Congratulations, she said quietly, on the baby. Thank you. Camilla's smile was cautious but genuine, as David and Camilla left to begin drafting the formal trust amendment. Ellie lingered with Margaret at the cafe table, watching her mother with new eyes. I don't understand, she admitted. A week ago, you were ready to expose everything in court to keep the house. Now you're making peace? Accepting a compromise? Margaret sipped her cold coffee, considering how to explain the transformation. The house was never really the point, Ellie. It was what it represented, my place in the world, my contribution, my legacy. I thought I needed to fight for it to prove my worth. She set down her cup. The memorial showed me something different. What? That I get to define my own worth. That Walter's betrayal and Camilla's manipulation don't diminish who I am or what I've built. Margaret smiled slightly. And that sometimes winning looks nothing like what you expected. From where they sat, Margaret could see a sliver of the Cooper River, flowing steadily toward the ocean, carrying away the old while bringing in the new with each tide. She thought of the house that had been her anchor for 40 years, how fighting for it had forced her to discover an inner strength she'd never recognized. "What will you do now?" Ellie asked. "Stay in the house?" Margaret considered this. For weeks, the question had been whether she could keep the house. Now, unexpectedly, the question was whether she wanted to. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "For the first time in decades, I get to decide what I want, not what Walter would have wanted or what tradition dictates. That's a kind of freedom I never expected at 68. Ellie covered her mother's hand with her own. "Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you, Mom. You found a way through this that didn't destroy us all." "Sometimes," Margaret replied, "the strongest thing you can do isn't fighting to the death. It's knowing when to lay down your weapons and build something new from the rubble." As they walked back along the promenade, Margaret spotted a young couple with a toddler, the child teetering on unsteady legs between doting parents. In less than a year, David and Camilla would be in a similar tableau, their child a new chapter in the Whitmore story. A legacy not of brick and mortar, but of flesh and blood and complicated, imperfect love. Margaret turned her face to the sun, feeling its warmth like a benediction. The house was hers again, or would be once the papers were filed. But she had gained something far more valuable in nearly losing it, herself, emerging from Walter's shadow at last, not as a diminished widow but as a woman in her own right, making her own choices, writing her own story. Tomorrow, she would return to the house, not to defend it against Camilla, but to decide what it meant to her now in this new chapter. Whether to keep it as a repository of memories, transform it into something different, or perhaps even let it go entirely. For the first time since Walter's death, the future felt not like a closing door, but an opening one, wide and unexplored, waiting for her to step through. The house stood empty on moving day, furniture draped in white sheets like patient ghosts. Margaret had decided, to everyone's surprise, including her own, to sell the family home and start fresh. The decision came not from bitterness or defeat, but from a newfound clarity. Walls that had once sheltered her now felt like they were containing her. Early morning light slanted through windows that no longer wore curtains, casting long rectangles across hardwood floors. Margaret moved through the rooms alone, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. She had asked for this final hour of solitude, before the movers arrived for the last few boxes. A private farewell to the stage that had hosted 40 years of her life. In the living room, she traced the faint shadow on the wall where Walter's law degree had hung. The kitchen counter still bore the slight stain from when 5-year-old Ellie had spilled grape juice during Thanksgiving preparations. The banister held the invisible imprint of thousands of touches, David sliding down it despite repeated warnings, Walter's hand steady as he descended for dinner, Margaret's own grip as she climbed the stairs weary after long days. "We were happy here," she said aloud to the emptiness. "Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely happy." She climbed the stairs slowly, visiting each bedroom. David's, still bearing the faded outline of sports pennants on the wall. Ellie's, where the light fell just right for reading on rainy afternoons. The master bedroom, where she and Walter had slept side by side for decades, close enough to touch, but often separated by unspoken distances she only now recognized. Downstairs again, she saved Walter's study for last. The room had been the epicenter of so much. The discovery of the trust documents, the hidden journals, the secrets that had fractured and ultimately transformed her understanding of her marriage. Now it stood empty except for his desk, the one piece she hadn't sold or distributed. It would go to David's new home office, a gesture of continuity amid so much change. Margaret unlocked the bottom drawer, the same one that had concealed Walter's journals, and placed inside a sealed envelope addressed simply, "For the next generation." Inside was a letter she had written over several nights, distilling the wisdom earned through loss and recovery. To whoever finds this letter, you are likely a Whitmore, by blood or by choice, curious about the history of this desk and the man who once sat behind it. Walter Whitmore was a complex man, brilliant and flawed, loving and distant, respected and troubled. He built a life that looked perfect from the outside while carrying private burdens few ever saw. "I was his wife for 40 years, and I learned too late that loving someone completely doesn't mean loving only their perfect parts."
True love encompasses the full, messy reality of a person, their mistakes, their fears, their secrets. Walter never quite believed this. He thought he needed to be flawless to be loved. Whatever brought you to this drawer, whatever questions you're asking about family or legacy or belonging, know this: the greatest inheritance isn't property or money or even reputation. It's the courage to live authentically, to speak truth, to forgive imperfection, others and your own. The Whitmore legacy isn't perfect, but it's real. May you build upon it with more wisdom than we sometimes showed. And may you find the balance we sometimes missed between preserving what matters and releasing what doesn't. With hope for your journey, Margaret Whitmore, June 2025. Beside the letter, she placed the most revealing of Walter's journals, not to expose him, but to humanize him for those who would come after. Some secrets deserved to die, but others needed to breathe in the light, their poison neutralized by understanding. She closed the drawer, not locking it this time. Discovery would come or not come in its own time, by its own path. Outside, a car door slammed. Ellie's voice called from the driveway, "Mom, the movers are here!" Margaret took one last look around the study, whispered a silent goodbye to Walter, and walked toward the future waiting outside. The cottage sat on a gentle rise overlooking a small pond just 3 blocks from Ellie's home. Built in the 1940s, it had none of the grandeur of the Whitmore house, but possessed a weathered charm that had spoken to Margaret immediately. Climbing roses framed the front door, their pink blooms nodding in the warm breeze. The entire space could fit inside the first floor of her old home, but already it felt more truly hers than the house ever had. Ellie supervised the movers with clipped efficiency, directing furniture placement with the same attention to detail she brought to legal briefs. The reading chair goes by the east window. Mom gets the best light there in the morning. Margaret let her daughter take charge, amused by the role reversal. For so many years, she had been the one creating homes for others. Now, others were helping create a home for her. By late afternoon, the cottage had transformed from empty rooms to the beginnings of a new habitat. Bookshelves lined the small study. Margaret's favorite kitchen implements hung from a copper rack above the vintage stove. The bed was made with fresh linens, ready for her first night in this new chapter. "What do you think?" Ellie asked, collapsing onto the sofa beside her mother. "Will it work?" Margaret looked around at the carefully arranged pieces of her past life, repositioned to support her future one. "It already feels like home," she said truthfully. The doorbell chimed, a soft, melodic sound unlike the formal ring of the Whitmore house. David stood on the porch, Liam and Nora beside him, each carrying housewarming gifts. "First visitors," Nora announced proudly, presenting a potted orchid with ceremonious care. Liam handed over a rolled paper tied with blue ribbon. "We made this for you, Grandma." Margaret unrolled it to find a drawing, the old Whitmore house on one side, her new cottage on the other, connected by a winding path lined with flowers. Above both, in careful block letters, "Home is where you are." "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely touched. "I'll frame it for the study wall." David hung back slightly, still finding his footing in this new family configuration. The settlement, with Camilla, had been finalized last week. The house officially returned to Margaret's name just in time for her to sign the sale papers. The beach cottage renovation had already begun, with Camilla overseeing the project with characteristic thoroughness. "Camilla sends her regrets," David said, handing Margaret a small potted plant. A miniature rose, its buds just beginning to open. A card nestled among the leaves read simply, "Thank you for not destroying me. Beginnings, not endings. C." Margaret placed the rose on the windowsill where it would catch the morning sun. A tentative peace offering from a woman who had nearly become her nemesis, but was now unexpectedly expanding the boundaries of family in more ways than one. "She's having a rough day with morning sickness," David explained, "but she wanted you to have this." "Tell her it's perfect," Margaret replied. And it was. A living thing that would require care and patience, that would bloom and fade and bloom again if tended properly, not unlike the complex relationship they were all trying to build. That evening, Margaret hosted her first dinner in the cottage. Nothing elaborate, just pasta and salad served on her familiar dishes now at home on a new table. David and Ellie sat side by side, their childhood rivalry softened into adult companionship. Liam and Nora argued good-naturedly about which streaming show to watch after dinner. Ordinary family moments that felt extraordinary to Margaret after weeks of tension and conflict. As they finished dessert, a store-bought cheesecake that no one pretended was homemade, Ellie raised her glass. "To Mom and her new beginning." "And to Dad," David added quietly. "The good and the complicated parts." "To all of us," Margaret amended, "finding our way forward together." Later, after everyone had gone, Margaret sat on the cottage's small back porch, listening to frogs singing by the pond. Above her, stars punctured the velvet darkness, the same stars that had shone over the Whitmore house for decades, now offering their light to this new sanctuary. She thought of Walter, not with the aching grief of recent months, but with a complex tenderness. He had been a flawed man who loved imperfectly, who had hurt her while trying to protect her, who had never quite believed he was worthy of being fully known. Perhaps in some way, his final betrayal had been a gift, forcing her to emerge from the comfortable shadow of their marriage into the full light of her own strength. Tomorrow, she would begin planting the garden. Not the formal landscaping Walter had preferred, but something wilder, more natural. Ellie had already delivered flats of native perennials, plants that would return year after year, growing stronger with each season. Liam had helped her mark out the beds, his lanky teenage frame surprisingly at ease with practical tasks. Roots, not walls, would define this new chapter. Margaret breathed in the night air, feeling neither triumphant nor defeated, but something rarer, genuinely present. The house that had once defined her was already becoming a memory, not erased, but properly placed in the story of her life. In a few months, she would hold Walter's grandchild, a new life untouched by old secrets, a continuation of the family line despite its fractures and repairs. David and Camilla were cautiously rebuilding their marriage on more honest ground. Ellie had finally scheduled a coffee date with the attorney who'd been asking her out for months. Liam had made the honor roll. Nora was learning cello. Life was proceeding, as it always did, carrying them all forward regardless of their readiness. From inside the cottage, the phone rang. June calling to check on the move. Margaret smiled, grateful for the friendship that had weathered even the revelation of long-kept secrets. Some bonds were strong enough to bend without breaking. As she rose to answer it, Margaret cast one last glance at the night sky. "Goodbye, house," she whispered. "Hello, home." She stepped inside, closing the door on the darkness, moving toward the light she had switched on for herself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.